Your Steve Jones Show podcast is loading now. The Steve Jones Show podcast is sponsored by Sunbury Motors, North 4th Street in Sunbury, and Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15 in Hummel's Wharf.
Joining us now is Chris Solari, Detroit Free Press. Chris, welcome. Great to have you with us. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. How are you doing?
Doing well. Obviously, at Michigan State, this is obviously horrific. Penn State, for example, in 1996 had a similar situation happen on its campus. So I know where you're sitting right now. The basketball game with Minnesota will not be played tonight. But first of all, before we get to that, what is it like at Michigan State right now? Because I guess nothing's happening there until at least Monday on campus with classes and so forth, correct?
Yeah, and they had initially canceled everything Tuesday and Wednesday before they had found the shooter while it was still an active situation. And then it was very shortly afterward that they found the shooter and he took his life. So that was, that's kind of one thing. There was a lot of, I don't even know if misinformation is the right word. There was just a lot of information and things flowing around at that point. Some of it was due to confusion. Some of it may have been misinformation. Some of it may have just been kind of the fog of war in some ways. There were reports of a second shooting well away from it, and police had confirmed that on their Twitter, or at least they had posted it on their Twitter, and then that turned out to be false. Apparently, there have been rumors of someone using fireworks that students had, during the active shooter heard potentially and thought they were gunfire. So there was a lot of chaos that was going on. It's hard to say this, but, because three really bright young individuals lost their lives in a classroom setting, or in the Union. And 5 others are still in critical condition. But honestly, when you think about the things that were happening, of the best case scenarios in the worst possible situation, this was probably it. I mean, the thought that keeps coming to my mind is, how did this happen? But then it's quickly followed up by, how didn't this happen sooner? I mean, Penn State understands this as good as anybody. When you have a very large, open public campus like that, people talk about soft targets and things like that. I mean, this wasn't someone that was a student. This wasn't someone that had any type of affiliation with the university, or by any accounts, not sure if he had any grudges. But where are you going to find large amounts of people in small areas, college campuses? And, it's that in and of itself, in both ways, kind of leaves you, that it wasn't a student, kind of leaves you nervous that anybody can go do this. But, that there's no easy feeling right now. I mean, it's just an uneasy feeling for everybody, and sadness, a lot of sadness, and a lot of it's going to take some time to heal.
And Michigan State's like a lot of college campuses, if I recall correctly, and all the times I've been there, it's pretty much an open door policy there. At certain buildings, you need a key to get in.
Yeah,
but classrooms are open.
I think the dorms after 9/11, that now we're talking 22 years ago, so this generation doesn't even know it. I mean, when I was in college there, the dorms were open, free of unfettered access until after midnight. Then you had to be checked in by someone who lived there. That went away, I believe. I think they started locking the dorms at all times after 9/11. Okay. But some of the campus buildings would be open, and then I think they would close them on football Saturdays at that point, that they had previously been open. But now I believe the classroom buildings are open. And at Berkey Hall, where the first shooting happened was a classroom, and it's right next to the union, the student union.
Yep. Yes,
that's how the gunman went in there afterward, right next door, and then left by foot. On and off campus that quickly.
Yeah, on and off that quickly. In fact, they found him, he ended up killing himself a few miles off campus? Yeah. Sports obviously will not solve any of this, but in some ways will bring back maybe not healing, but a sense of normalcy. So the Minnesota game is off right now. It's postponed. Minnesota went through COVID. Penn State will play them on Saturday night. The make-up COVID game with Illinois is Monday. How difficult is it going to be to find a space to make up this game down the road once some things settle down?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult because there's only, I think now we're inside of 20 days left in the regular season. And by the time you get to next week, I mean, obviously Michigan State wouldn't do anything at the back end of this week with Michigan coming up on Saturday, assuming that game is going to be played. We still haven't heard officially yet. I would think at this point it probably will be played.
I agree.
If you'd asked me 24 hours ago, I would have thought the other way. But I would assume I wouldn't assume it, but I think it's trending that way that they'll still play it. So Michigan State wouldn't do anything this week. Then obviously next week, with the game already shoehorned in there, I don't know if Minnesota would. They obviously wouldn't be able to the following week. So, we were talking about the last week. And the way this schedule has been set up this year, and Tom Izzo has been a very big critic of it, I think at least 12 of their 20 Big Ten games have been 3 days apart. And, in long stretches of 3 games, or a game, day off, travel, game. And that makes it really complex to, on top of the Minnesota's schedule issues, to try and just get this jammed in there one more day, and then, oh, by the way, we're gonna wear down your legs in the last week of the regular season right before the tournament. So whether or not that gets, it might not have any bearing, quite honestly. Minnesota pretty well seems locked into the last spot. For Michigan State, it would be a win that would be very beneficial in a crowded middle, but ultimately, I don't know if they end up making this up just because of that. I'm still waiting to hear back on a lot of things. Obviously, there's some pretty important discussions that are going on over there right now, and some people have been kind of not quiet, but obviously in meetings and doing other things. So, trying to wait and hear out what may be the plan for that, and we're expecting to hear in the next couple of days from Tom Izzo, who's also been kind of keeping low after all this.
Yeah, no question, and can't blame them either. It's just a gut feeling. It's just a gut feeling from 30,000 feet. I think they play Saturday night, but that's just me from 30,000 feet. Michigan State's in the thick of this thing. Their defense has been really good, but their offense has still been not exactly pedal to the floor. How can Tom fix that?
It's a good question. This team isn't necessarily built that way. Particularly,
to be honest with you, Chris, this league isn't built that way.
Yeah. I think they've got 10 guys on scholarship, based him not going into the portal out of a choice. I think they explored some guys that didn't pick Michigan State, and then they didn't just want to add bodies. But I think that the fact that they don't have a 5 that can run the floor consistently. They hoped Sissoko would be that guy, and he's struggled with that at times. And the youngsters Kohler and Cooper, are playing a lot of minutes for how young they are, but they're not floor runners. So now you have to try and play around it a little bit. The wings can get out and run more, and I think that at some point, now you're starting to see a little potential for it with Jaden Akins getting back to. I'd say Jaden Akins is back 100% now, and he was going to be one of their big floor runners. But you still have Malik Hall hampered with an ankle or the high ankle sprain. So not a high ankle sprain, but the stress reaction in the foot that it still causes him issues. So you'd lose another guy that runs in transition. So it's, it is complex, and, the one thing that they have done is limit their turnovers, which, they were 16, 17 turnovers a game at one point the last few years. They cut it down to about 11 this year. But in the half court, they're not getting consistent possessions, and there's a lot of standing around that I think needs to be corrected. And that, a lot of that goes to A.J. Hoggard starting to attack north and south and, get downhill and either go to the basket or kick it out. He did it a couple times in recent weeks, particularly the Maryland game, setting up Joey Hauser and a couple other guys. But, I think, for that offense, the key is Hoggard, and quite honestly, Sissoko needs to step up as well in the post and provide them a little more than what he's given.
And Hauser can certainly have his moments, there's no doubt.
Hauser's been fairly consistent this year.
Yeah, I agree.
He's comfortable. He's had some bad shooting games, but one thing I have liked about seeing when he does have the bad shooting games, then he starts to work around the basket to try and get a rhythm or hit some mid-range jumpers, which I think have helped him in-game make those adjustments to start hitting outside.
Chris, the Big Ten is going to get a lot of teams into the NCAA tournament, 8, and who knows, maybe they can squeeze a 9th in, who knows. I think getting out of the first weekend for the vast majority is going to be difficult. The conference is play, in my opinion, the conference is played right now. And look, this is not against coaches. Please, I don't want anybody to think it's going to. A coach has to pick a style to play based on the personnel he has and how to win. So let's take that off the table. But this conference is played in a phone booth, and it's officiated in a phone booth. The rest of the country's playing 94 by 50.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing is, like, it doesn't matter. I mean, you haven't seen really good officiating across the board, no matter which team you watch or follow.
I agree.
There are points where you can say, I mean, there was a 5-second stretch where I think the refs missed a foul at the rim. They missed a goaltend with someone sticking their hand through the basket, and then they missed an out-of-bounds call the other way. So it was 3 different calls that were missed, and all, for 2 different teams. So I don't, and you obviously have to play through that. And I think both teams have to play through that, but it's the constant adjustment in game too. I mean, we've talked about this for years, that refs will go into halftime and the game all of a sudden stops being called how it was in the first half and changes into the second half. Well, you're still seeing that. I mean, the Ohio State-Michigan State game the other day, there were 3 free throws in the entire game.
Yep.
And there was a lot more contact than that in that game. So, it doesn't make sense. I think the refs are struggling with the verticality rule of what is and isn't a foul around the basket and above the rim. They're struggling with the freedom of movement rules that they're calling a lot of ticky-tack fouls outside, and whether it be hand-checking or moving screens or players supposedly sticking a knee out when they've set a legitimate screen. I mean, it's just although Tom Izzo had a really interesting point that the way the pace is right now with the sluggishness, with the calls and all the whistles and everything, that might be how a lot of the games in the tournaments get reffed. So, whether maybe that prepares you for a slower pace in the NCAAs. I don't know, though, because you're right. I think a lot of the teams around the country in other conferences are playing full-court basketball still. And, the Big Ten kind of looks, at times, archaic in that respect.
Right, and that's part, and I'll tell you another part, too. We get to the month of February, I always feel the officiating is the worst. Because, Chris, they're exhausted. I mean, I'm not going to get into the name of the official because I went through and I looked. This official had been in 12 places in 13 days. He did the Penn State Nebraska game, and the day before he did Clemson in South Carolina. I mean, how the heck do you get to Lincoln from Clemson. You got to go to Spartanburg, got to go to Chicago, got to go into Lincoln. Right? You're telling me that guy's fresh?
Well, there was a ref that MSU had a couple weeks ago who did a late game on the West Coast and then turned around and did, I think it was the Indiana game, perhaps, that did an afternoon game the next day on the East Coast time zone. So that, I mean, my goodness. I mean, how aren't you going to be? And,
right.
you know, that's another problem. I mean, there obviously aren't a lot of qualified refs, and they're all reffing every day of the week because conferences don't necessarily have contracts to just have their own referees. So, I mean, it is. I mean, listen, we can talk about, these athletes, you know, they're the highest, you know, they're highest trained and best conditioned, and they should be able to run for 40 minutes a game, 5 days a week, or whatever you want to call it. But the referees there's a physical component to that too, and that does wear on your mental state. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the answer for that is, but I think that a lot of people are cognizant of it now, and something needs to give or change in that respect.
Because in the game I was doing, Tominaga went up and the ball slipped out of his hands. He then caught it and then shot a three and hit it. And I'm not going to give the name of the official. I don't want to be unfair here. He said the ball was tipped. Kevin Kugler, Jess Settles, Dick Girardi, and I all looked at each other at the table and go, what was he looking at?
Oh, my goodness.
It wasn't even close. The ball was tipped.
I mean, it's not just the physical fatigue. It's the physical fatigue that compounds into the mental fatigue like that.
You got it. Yep, you got it. That's why I think in the tournament it gets better, because guess what? Okay, my first game's on a Thursday. I arrived Tuesday. What did I do? I slept. Wednesday night. Thursday, I get to work the Saturday game. Guess what I did after the Thursday game? I went back and I slept. And Friday I slept. Suddenly they're rested in the tournament. That's why it's usually a little bit better.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something with that. I think that's a good point, because they're not trying to go 50 different sites in 5 different days, you know.
Hey, if I was making the money they're getting per game plus per diem, I'd be trying to get as many games in as possible too.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think that's a real life issue that they need to figure out.
Yeah,
you know, I mean that because that does affect the game, and it affects the product in and of itself too, and you know, it drives coaches nuts. I mean, I don't think the Big Ten, had they known this ref had gone on the West Coast one night for a late game and then afternoon game in the East Coast the next day, would allow that.
Oh, there are 3-4 guys right now that are doing the Big Ten that are refereeing the Pac-12. Like, oh, really?
Well,
Chris,
just wait, because that might even get worse.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
When you add the next group, when you add in UCLA and USC, and maybe other teams, how does that change? You know.
Well, for USC and UCLA, where it's a little more finesse officiating in the Pac-12, Chris, they're in the shock of their lives.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This thing.
Oh, my goodness.
Awful time. We dealt with the awful time in the beginning. The end was a little more of a distraction. How about that?
Yeah, and that's, you know, it's hard right now when you've got your real-world things in what oftentimes in college environments are sheltered and secured, you know, both physically and mentally. I mean, these are supposed to be the escapes from the class for kids to go and watch their peers play basketball, play football, whatever other athletic events there are. And, you know, when it becomes secondary to real-life issues that young kids are learning at a young age. I mean, 18 to 22 is not an easy age in and of itself, let alone to deal with these type of things. I mean, there are kids that there was one student that we had a story on that was in the Sandy Hook shooting as a child and was on campus for this one. And there's obviously Oxford, Michigan had a shooting last year that was very highly publicized and there are students on campus that now are living through their second in a year. So, it's nice to think about sports and talk about sports, even sometimes when it does feel a little out of place. But you're right. I think you said it earlier. At some point, it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be a right time. But it will help the healing to get back to a little bit of normalcy.
And remember, these young people also have gone through COVID too. So
that's right.
They've been through a lot.
You think about this. I talked about this with someone yesterday. We're talking maybe back to the Vietnam War, where a group of college-age kids have been living on edge for this long a period of time. I mean, you're talking about 4 or 5 years of their lives, whether it be from the pandemic or college shootings or whatever it might be. I mean, this is, it's like I said a few minutes ago, it's not an easy time in and of itself, but then you add all these things in there, and it's complex. It's complex as a parent to explain to children. It's complex as an adult to process, and it's even more complex to see these kids going through it.
Chris, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, as always, my friend.
All right. Take care, Steve. We'll talk to you soon.